Hello, my name is Raquel Garcia, and for the analysis four, I think, literacy in the Rio Grande Valley, a deficit perspective, I've decided to do another short presentation and provide three examples of what I think qualify as a deficit perspective in our schools. So when we got the assignment, I wasn't too sure actually what it meant. So I had to kind of look it up, and I read some very interesting articles in regards to this and how we can actually view our schools or our students from a deficit perspective. So I did learn what that meant. So what does it mean? Deficit thinking can broadly be defined as a way of thinking about something that blames the victim, in this case, the students. So in schools, deficit thinking involves the act of blaming a student or a student's family, a student's culture for academic or behavioral difficulties that occur at school. So basically, when educators view students from a deficit perspective, we're pretty much, in my opinion, setting them up towards the path of failure, because we're suggesting that, a student's race or background, social, economic status, determines whether they're smart enough, capable enough to be successful. And of course, this isn't the case, but that's basically what deficit perspective means. So I got this quote directly from one of the articles that I found, which says deficit thinking blames students for their shortcomings and can lead to educators believing that such shortcomings are incapable of being changed or supported at school. So, I mean, obviously, a lot of these things cannot be changed. It's not something we can control. Obviously, we can't control the race of a child or their social economic status. But a lot of these, the way that we think about these kids, it's kind of sort of ingrained in our heads as educators, because we're instructed to label these students as such, which brings me to my first topic, which is or our first example, which is actually labeling students as at risk. And so this is an actual thing that we have to do as educators. We fill out these forms. We do look at their cumulative folders. We see, their income. We see their race. We see where they're coming from. We see the neighborhoods which they live in, and we classify these students at risk, which is, at risk of not graduating high school even. So labeling students as at risk can lead to harmful stereotypes, and it can cause educators to lower their expectations. And it's a deficit perspective that ignores, their strengths and their potential. Because I mean, a lot of these things, some of these things they obviously can't control, but it just kind of puts us in this box where, okay, we know this child is academically, in our heads, we think that this child is academically probably not going to succeed. Why? Because they're labeled as at risk, when in reality, that's it's all it is. It really is just a label. It doesn't really determine whether their child is capable or not. And so I remember um, my very first year teaching, when I was asked to fill out these forms, for family background and all of this information. And we had to, and this was pre-K, mind you, in PSJA. And so we had to actually conduct a small, like, assessment, like an evaluation. Does the child have good vocabulary? Do they know basic shapes? Do they know basic numbers? And students coming into pre-K don't know most of those things, because that's what pre-K is for. Pre-K is for oral language development, for learning those basic shapes, colors, numbers, things like that. So most of these kids, according to that assessment, were not passing, but it's not because of their social economic status or because of their culture or because of their race, because they were 4 years old and it's their first year in school. Most of them not coming from daycare, single, um, a single child, things like that. But it's not. Uh, I didn't find it. I found it very odd to label these students at such a young age and to circle the box where it says at risk for not graduating high school. Um, it was very surprising for me that that is a standard practice. I don't know if that's still done. In my district, that's not something that I fill out. It's not something that I do. But I know that they're still labeled as at risk. It's much like students are identified as LEP or limited English proficient, and they have these cumulative folders and they have these coded folders. So we know what the blue folder means, and we know what the red folder means, and we know what the green folder means. And so these kids are already placed, with a sticker at the very young age of 4 years old, um, and it's like predetermined for them. And these things are out of their control, like the structure at home, domestic issues at home, uh, even just like learning disabilities. These obviously are things that these students cannot control, and for us to go and label them as at risk, it's kind of it's a harmful thing. I think it's very stereotypical, and I think that's one of the ways that we can view these students from a deficit perspective. So, example number two is going back to to all the articles that we've previously read. It's just ignoring the cultural and linguistic assets of these students. So, ignoring the fact that they are limited English proficient, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. For them to have for Spanish to be their primary language. For me, as a teacher, or I've been teaching for several years now, but at the very beginning, it kind of was, they made it seem as though that was a negative. But these children are ultimately they're bilingual students, and they're learning two languages at once, because especially at such a young age, they're trying to develop their native language, their Spanish native language, and learning all this rich vocabulary through read alouds, or through oral language development, through music, through songs, through rhyme. And because they're very young, they're only 4, but for them to be able to grasp their native language and also grasp the English language, to me, that's not a deficit. That's something that is actually very difficult to do, and especially for kids at such a young age. So for us to just ignore the fact that they are bilingual, or at least the way I've seen it, because it's kind of been pushed upon us, like students that know Spanish, like, oh no, submerge them in English. Like, we want them to transition right away. The more English, the better. And it's kind of straying away from their native language. But I mean, then there's this like disconnect, and we don't value their native language as much as we should, and they should be able to embrace that. They should be able to find the value, the importance of that. And so we've read about this, and we've learned about this as the course has gone on. And I've learned that culture obviously plays a big role in a child's education. So acknowledging and just appreciating the cultural and like their language, their linguistic um, strength is just extremely important. So for us to ignore this, that's kind of one another way that we view these students from a deficit perspective. Which brings me to example number three. And this is something that it's ongoing. It's currently going on right now at my campus, like just standardized testing. So relying on these test scores to measure the success, of these students. So relying solely on standardized test scores, um, it's a very narrow-minded view of what a student can and cannot do. Because I mean, and I'm not saying I'm like against testing, because obviously you kind of want to measure, where they start from point A and on how they get to point B, and we want to see that growth. But for us to just solely, focus on just standardized testing, or like exclusively, Obviously that limits the way that we measure a student's growth, because, and it's ironic that because as teachers we've been instructed all year long, differentiate your instruction, and then here comes this at the end of the year, this standard test, and it's a one size thing for student A and student B, when we know that student A is lacking certain things or student B is lacking certain things, and we've modified for student A all year long, but yet here we have to give student A and student B the same, test. And so obviously these results can sometimes not really provide us with accurate, an accurate depiction, because some students, I mean, all students, all students are gifted, but I've seen it over and over again where a child just does poorly on tests. A child can't concentrate long enough to even take the test. Um, and so that grade that they receive for that assessment can kind of just impact, the way that teachers see them. And moving on from one year to the next, we look at those scores. So, oh, this Juanito, is that bubble kid, or it's that kid that's just going to fail. And we tend to just, okay, this child, we're not going to focus on this child. This child is going to fail this exam, we're going to move them aside. And that happened to me my first year when I started teaching. I've always taught the lower grades, but I did do a testing grade a couple years back, and it happened where it's like, okay, no, these kids are called bubble kids. These are your passers and these are your fails. So your bubbles are the ones you focus on. Your passers, don't worry about them, and your fails, don't worry about them. They're gonna fail. And so it was very shocking that these teachers that had been teaching, for years. This is the advice, that I was given, like, work on your bubble kids. And I didn't even know what a bubble kid was, because I don't know if it's a term they made up themselves, if they've heard it somewhere else. What was a bubble kid, I asked. Oh, because they're in between, so they can either, pass, or they can either fail. So that's the bubble. So all of these things, I think, just it impacts these students in such a way. um, and sometimes we tend to do things we probably don't even realize we're doing them. um, and a lot of my perspective, or the ideas that I've had, have changed as time has gone on. Like, we're teaching, education is changing, constantly evolving, but I think these students are very different also. And this course has shown me so much about, how important culture and language is, and how we can, address those things, um, and value those things, and how those things impact these students in such a way, that I probably didn't even think about previously. So what do we do about this? So instead of framing local schools, from a deficit perspective, what we should do, and what we should be doing is celebrating their strengths, their assets, the diversity, the language amongst these students. And so embracing the culture, embracing the language, embracing all of these things that kind of just have been downplayed for such a long time, I think. um, it happened to me when I was a student. And I'm glad to see that it has shifted from many years ago. Um, so, it's, I guess it's time for that change. And so just addressing these issues, and knowing and being aware that this is going on, I mean, that really does help us as educators, and just makes us, better overall. And so here's my resource. It was just that one article that I found. I did get a lot of good information from there, and read on that, and that's where I got my quotes and my information from. But that is all. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.